Good afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland and this week's Full Scottish. It's Sunday the 5th of October and my name is Brian Liddy. On the programme this week, we're delighted to be joined in the studio live by Chris Stephens. Welcome, Chris. Thank you for coming in.
Thanks very much, Brian. Pleasure.
And forgive me. And we are also delighted to welcome Anthony Salamone, founder of European Merchants. Good afternoon, Anthony. How are you?
Well, thank you, Brian. Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I take it neither of you were tempted to take part in today's Glasgow Marathon because you're both here, but that's to our benefit. We wouldn't have a show if you didn't, but I just wanted to wish all the runners who are taking part our best wishes. And to start the show is today's Ukraine update. Ukrainian Foreign Intelligence Agency official Ole Alexandrov has said China is providing intelligence to Russia to enable Moscow to better launch missile strikes inside Ukraine. Ole Alexandrov told the state news agency Ukrinform that China was passing on satellite intelligence on targets, including those benefiting from foreign investment. Early this morning, Ukraine's Air Force said all of the country was under threat of fresh Russian missile attacks following hours of air raid alerts and warnings of drone and missile attacks. Andriy Sadovyi, the mayor of Lviv, a western Ukrainian city about 70 kilometres from the border with Poland, said missiles were approaching the city after air defence systems were already engaged heavily in repelling a Russian drone attack. Poland scrambled jets early this morning after the airstrikes on western Ukraine. According to flight tracking service Flight Radar 24, early on Sunday, commercial flights were using routings typically used when Poland's Lublin and Rzeszów airports near the border with Ukraine were closed. Lithuania suspended air traffic at Vilnius airport due to balloons possibly flying in its airspace on Saturday, and flights have been diverted to neighbouring Poland and Latvia. Lithuania is a strong supporter of Ukraine, shares a 679-kilometre border with Belarus, a close ally of Russia. The incursion into Lithuania follows drone sightings and air incursions at airports in Copenhagen and Munich in recent weeks. A Russian combined strike killed a woman and wounded 6 other people in Zaporizhzhia, Ivan Fedorov, the head of the southeastern Ukrainian region, said. 1 person was killed and about 30 others were injured after 2 Russian drones struck trains at a station in Ukraine's northern Sumy region. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called the attack brutal on Telegram, posting a video of a wrecked burning passenger carriage and others with their windows blown out. The head of Ukraine's railways, Alexander Petrovsky, said Russia was intensifying a campaign of airstrikes on the network in an attempt to isolate frontline communities ahead of winter. On Saturday, the Ukrainian military reported it hit one of Russia's largest oil refineries again in a nighttime drone strike that caused blasts and a fire at the Kryshi refinery near St. Petersburg, more than 1,200 kilometres from the Ukrainian border. Populist billionaire Andrej Babis's triumph in the Czech parliamentary elections is expected to reduce the EU member country's support for Ukraine. Babiš has said he would review a Czech-led international drive to supply artillery shells to Ukraine, launched by the previous government. Anthony, I wonder, is there anything that you might want to highlight? Perhaps Lithuania or the Czech, the developments in the Czech government. Which would you prefer?
Well, maybe if I combine them together, Brian, to just take a little bit of wider perspective here in terms of the continuing or fraying support within the European Union and indeed the United States for Ukraine and what that means for the conflict more generally. I think we're in a space where um, it, that support is it's stable, but it's obviously been challenged, not least by Donald Trump or other populist leaders in EU countries, particularly East, but also in Western Europe. But what does that mean overall? We want the war to end. Russia is the aggressor. Russia has invaded Ukraine. The war will continue until Russia stops invading Ukraine, draws. And Russia's strategy has always been one of trying to outlast its opponents, uh, and it presumably continue to do so until or unless there's some sort of political fatigue or change within Russia. So that requires a unity of purpose within the European Union and wider, of course, including the UK and other partners. And the longer things go on, of course, we have our democratic systems. People become impatient, concerned with sending resources to another country. All of these things are quite predictable, but it's absolutely essential that that resolve is maintained. And for the Czech, for instance, Czech elections that may come under strain, but hopefully the collective resolve will continue. In terms of the Lithuanian issue, we see this increasing hybrid threats from Russia manifesting within NATO and within the European itself. This would be a great cause for concern and perhaps lead people to think why is Russia pursuing this sort of track now? What might it mean for the future? Creates a lot of uncertainty.
Thank you, Anthony. Chris, could I maybe throw you a bit of a curveball, because it wasn't in the report, but did you hear that Putin said this week in Sochi that if Trump had been in power, the conflict in Ukraine could have been avoided, which is something that Trump has said more than once?
Well, I think they're both supporting each other to a certain extent in relation to that. Whether that's the reality or not, I don't think so. I think Putin has certainly a view as to how large Russia should be. I mean, I still remember his comments just after he invaded Ukraine, in which he appeared to blame Lenin and suggest that Ukraine only existed because of Lenin's local government reorganisation, which was a stretch to say the least. So I think that we continue to watch these developments. I'm still very, very concerned for the people of Ukraine and what's happening. It certainly feels that Putin, and to a lesser extent Trump, have designs on the assets and national resources of Ukraine. And I think that's a lot of what this is about.
Thank you, Chris. And now today's Middle East update. At least 67,074 Palestinians have been killed and 169,430 people have been wounded in Gaza since the 7th of October 2023. The Israeli bombardment of Gaza is intensifying. Universities and residential buildings are being reduced to rubble, while Trump says his peace deal is close to agreement. But will Hamas accept the terms of Trump and Netanyahu's peace deal? And even if they do, would Israel ever really be serious about agreeing to a two-state solution? Chris, what do you think?
Well, let's talk about the flotilla first. I mean, I noticed that and I'm aware that one of the people who was stopped by the Israeli forces is Sid Khan, one of our
We're going to come on to
office bearers on
the
that.
flotilla next.
Well, we'll come on to the flotilla next.
So it's a peace deal.
Peace deal. I have my doubts about how this is going to develop and whether it is going to lead to peace. It seems that I have very real concerns of Tony Blair's involvement in some of this as some sort of Governor General or Viceroy of Gaza. I think that scares a lot of people in the international community, not just people based here. So we'll see. I have my doubts about whether Israel or indeed Trump want a two-state solution, or whether in actual fact they want a one-state solution.
Chris, you mentioned Blair. He went to the Oval Office recently, and I've asked twice on this show what's Blair up to, and then we found out the 20 points from Trump and Netanyahu's plan, which was totally agreed without any Palestinians or nobody from Hamas within the room. And now Blair's gone quiet. Do you think maybe he looked at what Trump was suggesting and has backed away from it all?
Well, I don't know. You just never know with Tony Blair, to be honest with you. I mean, this is a guy who sanctioned the second Iraq war, and then inexplicably after he left office was a Middle East peace envoy. So that didn't compute. But I would be very, very concerned about Tony Blair's involvement in any of this at all, given his track record in the Middle East, and indeed on what side he is on, because I have very, very real concerns about the pro-Israel lobby and their impact in UK and indeed some Scottish politics.
Thank you, Chris. Anthony, when I saw the terms of 20 points that was being put forward by Netanyahu and Trump, I thought that Hamas's decision or response to that would be, there's no way that we're going to accept any of that. That's a surrender pact that you're asking us to give up everything without any kind of conditions. And yet they seem to, they've kind of said, oh, we can maybe work with this, but what do you think of the peace deal?
So I think that any lasting peace has to be one in which all parties feel that they have something that's worthwhile. An imposed deal is not going to last either at all or indeed in the long term. As you and Chris were discussing there are two issues. One is to stop the onslaught that is ongoing now, and second is a long-term peace that would enable a two-state solution. The focus, which I suppose is unsurprising, is mostly on the first one, how to stop Israel's invasion of Gaza, which Israel conducting it. Obviously, Israel would be the one who would need to cease its efforts in that respect. And while also linking that through to the longer term solution of peace and an Israeli state that can coexist and work together in a positive way. We seem so far removed from that, and it's a very challenging space because it doesn't seem clear that the Israeli government, the present one, is committed to the two-state solution. Any longer, and I don't know how we return that back to where it was before. But if it's truly the case that Hamas, wider Palestinians, and the Israelis want help in negotiating some sort of peace, there are plenty of people in the international community who are able to do so. I don't necessarily think that in this context the United States is best placed to try to attempt to fill that role. Perhaps in years gone by, the US, with its global clout, or indeed some potential degree of being seen as in the middle between the two parties, might be able to help. But it's pretty clear that the United States is on the side of Israel. And in that context, it's not neutral. I said there are plenty of people within the United Nations or European countries that have plenty of experience of mediating, like Norway, like Switzerland, like Finland in some respect, who would be willing to do their part to help broker a true, actual, lasting peace between the two sides, but that requires both sides to be fully invested.
Thank you, Anthony. As Greta Thunberg's aid flotilla got closer to Gaza this week, it was boarded by Israeli forces while still in international waters. Chris, my question to you is that no sane person would ever try and deliver aid directly via a flotilla if the Israeli government hadn't placed completely unacceptable restrictions on the flow of aid in the first place, creating the humanitarian catastrophe that's unfolding in Gaza now. Is that right?
Well, I think that is the case. Now, people feel very passionately about this, and they are absolutely sickened by the fact that Israel seems to be playing games around aid. And I noticed that on the flotilla itself, one of the people who are on that flotilla is my friend, Sid Khan, who you will know, Brian, is a senior office bearer with Scottish Asians for Independence. So I've seen the videos in which the Israeli forces are boarding the flotilla, and I just think that's quite a disgraceful situation. We really need aid. I mean, the important issue here is there are people starving in Gaza. They need aid, they need food, they need supplies, they need medical supplies. That has to happen. And I do think that if the Trumps and other people in the world are talking about a peace deal and a peace plan, they've got to allow that aid in, and they've got to tell the Israeli forces that what they did with this flotilla was wrong, and we've got to allow the flotilla to go in and deliver aid for the people of Gaza.
Thank you, Chris. Anthony, this issue about aid is actually linked to Trump's peace deal with Netanyahu, because one of the terms that they expect Hamas to agree to is, or they say that if Hamas agrees to the terms, then Israel will allow aid into Gaza. But international law and human rights states that Israel should be letting aid in. It shouldn't be something that is to be negotiated. And now we've got the Greta Thunberg's aid flotilla having to fill the gap.
Yes, aid cannot be conditional. I think international humanitarian law is extremely clear in this area. And indeed, Israel as a state with resources, as an occupying force, and all of these roles, has in alignment with those roles, has the responsibility to ensure that the basic principles of international law are upheld, which is that civilians are not part of the conflict, they have access to food, to water, to medical supplies, to sanctuary, to all of the basic principles. Now, it's very clear that the United States government, under Donald Trump at least, is skeptical of international law generally, or its practical application in a place like Gaza, which I suppose means that's why the United States government or administration present is more amenable to considering some sort of negotiation in which aid is involved. But I hope that the rest of the international community will continue to realize that that is not appropriate. Keeping in mind, of course, that there are other countries in the world, including Russia, of course, and China, who may well be happy to subscribe to this new version of international rules where what we consider to be basic principles are up for barter. But I hope that the rest of the world can convince everyone that that's not appropriate, nor indeed something we want to accept.
Thank you, Anthony. And then, of course, this week there was a horrific attack on a synagogue in Manchester. But the fallout from that attack in the news and media has been incredible. The genocide being inflicted upon Palestine cannot be used to justify the horrific terror attack on the synagogue in Manchester. And none of the people arrested at rallies in support of Palestine action yesterday had any connection to the Manchester terrorist. So I suppose my question is to you, Chris, should pro-Palestine protests have gone ahead this weekend, or should folk with Palestinian flags on their window maybe take them down just for a few days as a mark of respect and sympathy for the Jewish people?
Well, I think we need to be careful here, and I think that some of the rhetoric probably needs to be dialed down at the moment. I mean, I think there's genuine anger, I think, on a lot of what's taken place in the last week. Nobody can justify the despicable incident and terrorist attack in Manchester. No one can justify that. That was an act of terror, and it was completely unacceptable and despicable. And I realise that people will be angry about that, particularly the Jewish community, and they should be angry about that. What I would qualify is that what I have noticed, certainly when I was a Member of Parliament, the correspondence I was getting for the pro-Palestine position and for the people of Gaza were very often people I know within the trade union movement and others who have a Jewish upbringing. So I think that we need to be very careful that we're not splitting this issue on religious grounds. There's obviously historical aspects to that, but I don't think we should encourage this view that everyone who is Jewish has a certain position and everyone who is Muslim has a certain position. I do think that that is wrong. I think that when you're protesting and when you're engaging in protest activity, you of course have to be mindful that whatever you're doing is to build public support for your position. And you make the case very well, Brian, that people who have Palestine Action T-shirts have no relationship with the individual terrorist at all. So I think that we have to support the right of protest. It can't be conditional. But at the same time, common sense has to apply here when people are protesting, that they're continuing to build that public support. I do think it's a complete overreaction for people to be arrested for having the words Palestine in action on a T-shirt. I do think that is wrong. And I think also in relation to this, the prescribing of Palestine action was wrong. But I think that we do need to give due regard to voices in our community who, if we believe in a democratic society, you have to take account and have to be aware of other people's views, and you have to respect those views. Now, I tend not to agree with the position that Israel is an innocent victim. I don't. I think Israel has been the aggressor for a long period of time, and I think that what they have done against the people of Gaza in particular breaches international law. But so we need to be careful in all of this, and I think that we have to explain positions and make sure that we're not dialing up the rhetoric, because there are times when the rhetoric has to die down and continue to explain why we have the positions that we have.
Thank you, Chris. Anthony, have you seen, or I'm wondering, are some people going to take this opportunity, this massacre, use it as an opportunity to conflate or confuse the difference between criticising Zionism and criticising and anti-Semitism? You know, sometimes we've had Keir Starmer being accused of both recently, I think.
Well, I suppose we live in an era in which it seems that some people will always try to reduce complex issues or problems into less sort of cheap points, be they political or otherwise. I suppose that perhaps the social media environment that we live in has facilitated that sort of debasement or reduction in the value of public discourse. So yes, I suppose there will be people who try to take advantage of a complex problem and make it something simple to suit whatever argument they want to make for their own benefit or their own 15 minutes or longer of fame. But I very much echo the sort of thoughtful comments that Chris was making, and that we need it's so valuable in a democratic society that we can coexist with people who have different views than we do, including on very emotive, important topics that rightly should be the focus of public conversation, alongside important things in the domestic context too. So, you know, we have to be able to listen to views of people that we disagree with, and recognize that being able to have that within a democratic society is something very valuable. And even though it's being challenged in many parts of the world, we want to hold on to that.
Thank you, Anthony. And just before we move on, it's probably just worth mentioning that we're just a couple of days away from the anniversary of the 7th of October attack by Hamas in Israel in 2023. President Trump has said it's anarchy in Portland, Oregon. Locals say the opposite is true. On Tuesday, the White House had issued a press release which stated the radical left's reign of terror in Portland ends now. But Trump wanted to deploy the National Guard there anyway. And then a Trump-appointed federal judge temporarily blocked the president from deploying 200 National Guard troops to Portland. And now Oregon intends Oregon intends to sue the Trump administration over the plan to deploy troops. Anthony, Portland's only the latest city that Trump claims to have been taken over by terrorists. I'm just wondering, where does he get this notion from that American cities have to have troops sent into them because they're being overrun by left-wing terrorists?
I would struggle to answer that, but I'll do the best that I can in saying that Donald Trump is a fairly shallow showman who seems to enjoy occupying the limelight and will take whatever action is appropriate to ensure that the limelight is fixated on him. And if you take that desire to be in the spotlight combined with his minimal understanding of how basic government structures of the United States works, creates a situation in which he feels that it's appropriate to deploy the military within the mainland United States for fun. Which is kind of the short version. If we want to we can try and apply some intellectual analysis to it, but that's kind of where we are. So keeping in mind that the National Guard are mainly volunteers, so they're from Oregon or surrounding areas, for instance, people are reservists who are going about their business, who have signed up to be part of the National Guard to be ready to help their country in times of need, be that internationally or, of course, domestically. The National Guard is most often deployed within the United States to help deal with natural disasters. So I imagine that the people in the National Guard will be uh, uh, surprised or dumbfounded with the suggestion that they'll be deployed at the whim of the president within the United States for some unclear paramilitary operation that's not what they signed up for, undoubtedly. And I suppose we are seeing how well the American system of government can cope to the whims of a tyrannical president in the situation you mentioned, in which a lot of hope seems to rest on the judicial branch to check the executive branch. But it's extremely disappointing because, like every country, the United States has a host of challenges that it needs to face, serious problems. And the purpose of government is to address those problems and to help people and to assist those in need, not to make their lives worse, which seems to be the primary outcome of Donald Trump's policy.
So, Anthony, just quickly, you mentioned that the National Guard are volunteers, staffed by volunteers. Could people just refuse to then turn up and take part in Trump's orders?
No, I don't think so. I mean, volunteers, they're reservists. They volunteer to be reservists.
Okay, thank you.
Not active duty troops at the time.
Okay, they have to do what they're told. Chris, I'm just wondering, are the cities where Trump wants to deploy state militia usually controlled by the Democrats by any chance? Is the president punishing people for not voting Republican?
No, it's because it'll be because of Democrats, but it's because he's a man-child. I mean, we have to be aware of this when we're dealing with this guy. It's why other governments have to consider what tactics to deploy when they're discussing matters with him. This is a president who does not like at all any criticism and is very sensitive, I think is the polite word I will use, to any criticism whatsoever, whether it's about his policies or his character or whatever. So you have to consider all of is that he's also it's typical Trump politics. He will invent an enemy in his head, and he will then articulate very emotive language. It's very similar actually to some of the points we were making earlier, is that he deploys emotive language and emotive insults to his political opponents, making them enemies. And his way of dealing with a political discourse, I think, does set people off, particularly in the social media age. But this is because Portland, Oregon will not be complying with his wishes. He will also, I suspect, want to try and pick a fight with someone to try and, as what we know in politics is there's a dead cat on the table in relation to the actual shutdown, which you would think that would be his focus at this moment in time, is to try and address that issue and to negotiate a way in which not having the shutdown. I think that he likes to pick fights in order to try and distract people from his record, and I think this is just a typical example of it.
Thanks, Chris. When you say the shutdown, that's the US government shut down because they haven't agreed their budgets, I think. Yes. Is that right? Anthony, just the same question to you. Is the president punishing people for not voting Republican when he sends in the troops?
Well, I mean, that could be one reading of it, for sure. Donald Trump, in his tactics, seems to have a fixation on urban areas, which are likely to have Democratic voters who are likely to be more left-leaning, and who often are more open and welcoming of immigrants, all things that he is opposed to, both in terms of not considering those to be values of the Republican Party, but also those positions being the opposite of his. So yes, it does suggest that may be a fixation of his, but I suppose with the legal action that you mentioned, that the cities or states will do their best in legal terms to oppose whatever action you take in this respect. And imagine that if he were to sort of go up an invisible order against particular cities, that he may find a stronger response, particularly for tried this kind of action in New York or Boston. I suspect that the legal response would be even fiercer than.
Thank you, Anthony. Chris, we're out of time on this one, but we've got the US government in shutdown because they can't reach a budget agreement, and we've got the president sending troops into American cities. Should we be using the word fascist?
Well, we should certainly be using the word authoritarian. He very much has an authoritarian view of the world. I think we can accuse him of being anti-democratic. He's not yet reached the definition of fascist yet, in my view, but I think he's hugging the touchline, to use the football analogy. Certainly, I think his behaviour is more of what I've described earlier as man-child, and that and his sensitivities of criticism. I think that's probably one of the things, and authoritarian. But as Anthony has said, you are going to find that these places in America, the city administrations, the mayors, governors of democratic states in particular, are going to take him in court and going to continue to articulate a position in court. And the fact that some of these judges are very often Trump appointees tells you that perhaps he's going too far.
Thank you, Chris. So the Tories have started their conference in Manchester with Kemi Badenoch saying she will end net zero. She's going to create a USA-style, ICE-style anti-immigrant force, and she says that the UK is going to leave the ECHR, and this is all as Westminster parties race to the bottom where Reform UK resides. But the question that I really want to ask is, will the conference discuss Michelle Mone? Chris, is Mone going to come up in the...
I very much doubt it. Journalists may want to ask the question, but as I understand it, Michelle Mone has more or less resigned from the Conservative Party. That will probably be a relief to the Conservative Party, I would imagine. Quite a catty letter from what I've read that Michelle Mone had sent to Kemi Badenoch. I think the real story, though, from what you've said in the introduction of what Kemi Badenoch is saying in relation to ending net zero, creating more anti-immigrant forces, leaving the ECHR, is just how much the Tories are now in life support, and just how much that reform, the political party reform, are dominating the Westminster agenda down there and pulling everybody to the right. I think it's utterly extraordinary that that you have political parties. ECHR, for example, should be taken up as one of the successes of UK governments. It was first pushed by Winston Churchill to get this into force, and I think that it's quite extraordinary to me just how scared people are of reform and the unwillingness of political parties to take on reform's rhetoric around immigration, around government, that everything should be outsourced and privatised. And actually, we need to, I think, be a bit more revealing on what reform's policies actually are, particularly around workers' rights, particularly around the funding of public services, that they would and do support a Liz Truss-style budget, which is what you would see with reform coming in. I just find it extraordinary that the reluctance of either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party to take on the rhetoric of reform, particularly around immigration. I think the level of political discourse that's happening at Westminster now should be a great concern to us all.
Thank you, Chris. And Anthony, I really shouldn't have gone to this first. This is meant to be an add-on, so we can go back to other issues in a minute. But the company linked to Michelle Mone was ordered to repay £122 million for breaching a COVID PPE contract. She said in her letter, which Chris mentioned, so Kemi, my role was exactly the same as all the other Conservative MPs and peers were trying to help provide PPE. So on the above basis, I have done no wrong. What's your thoughts?
I haven't followed the issue at all, to be honest, Brian. So I don't know any more than what you just said now. I mean, if she's resigned from the Conservative Party, I mean, that, as Chris said, that would be good news for the
Okay.
leader. But yeah, no.
Okay.
So on the essence of the sort of policy positions that Kemi Badenoch is built to outline in the Conservative Party conference, you know, I would agree with what Brian was saying in the sense that, you know, both Labour and the Conservatives seem to want to try to outflank reform or avoid being outflanked by them. And I don't think that they'll be able to do that, right? I mean, I presume, would have thought that the politics of recent years would have demonstrated that you cannot out far right the far right, or indeed whatever sort of particular bête noire they've outlined. If that's sort of served up to them, they'll just come up with a new one. And of course, the biggest issue is Brexit, right? So we had Brexit, and now it's immigration, and then after that it's net zero, and whatever it is that, or indeed the ECHR, whatever it is that is served up and sacrificed in order to prevent UKIP or the Brexit Party or Reform or whatever it's called from doing well in politics, particularly in England, but of course in other parts of the UK, it won't work. You know, another strategy needs to be found. I can see why the Conservatives feel that this is their only potential salvation, or at least Kemi Badenoch and people around her think so. But I'm sure there must be some people in the Conservative Party who feel that you know, far more obvious is that their survival is trying to gain a centre ground, or indeed, you know, verging towards a bit of the centre left, which is what, you know, the Conservatives previously tried to do when they embraced the reality of climate change and the importance of addressing net zero in a real way. Things that were different in their years of opposition. So they were trained that, you know, this will not. It won't save them. They'll have to come with something else. But it's a real challenge, of course, that there seems to be a lot of like interest, if not support, for this kind of rhetoric. But I suppose the thing that seems strangest to me is this fixation on borrowing policies or indeed strategies from the United States. I mean, the UK is the European states. But well, why is it that, you know, if the US government is, you know, cracking down on immigration and using its agencies, that we must have the same thing? That doesn't make sense.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. And so to address the Tory conference in more substance, which is what we should have done first, the SNP, Chris, have warned that all of the Westminster parties have plans that will destroy Scotland's energy industry, which kind of sounds a bit like paranoia. But at the Tory party conference, Kemi Badenoch said that she's going to rip up the Climate Change Act. She's going to remove all net zero requirements on oil and gas companies drilling in the North Sea, taking a page out of Donald Trump's Drill Baby Drill notebook. And they're also planning to, meanwhile, Labour have brought in fiscal and licensing regimes that are going to force companies to leave the North Sea. And then, of course, Reform, absolutely, are going to close down net zero. So the SNP have a point.
Yes, they do have a point. And I think the energy of the country is very important. And you would think that given Scotland's role on exporting energy to the rest of the UK, there would be cognizance of that. But it doesn't seem that they are. I just think that what we're finding is that we're finding Reform in the Conservative Party denying science and denying reality. And, you know, I think the approach has to be taken in future. If you are granting licences, if you are going to do whatever you want to do with energy policy, you need to have some cognizance of what's happening with the environment and climate change as well. I think there's a balance that can be struck if you do it properly. But the rhetoric here basically is this, is that both the Conservative Party and to a certain extent the Labour Party are being dragged by Reform to blame other people for the fault of corporate interests, of government failures, and the failure to tackle in particular the cost of living crisis that's happening here in the United Kingdom. And it's a very serious cost of living crisis. There was no mention of it at the Labour conference, and I will willing to put a charity wager of £10 sterling with you, Brian, that the cost of living will not be mentioned once by a major Conservative politician at their conference this week.
Do I have to pay it in instalments, or can I pay it in
We
instalments?
can discuss the terms and conditions of that later.
Okay. Anthony, this thing about, similar to what the SNP were saying, and let's go back to the European Court of Human Rights. Kemi Badenoch at conference is going to say that she wants to leave the ECHR, which is the same as Reform. They would obviously trash the ECHR. They're in the lead to win the next general election, probably. But even Labour, their conference last week, they said that they didn't say that they're going to leave the ECHR, but they said that they're going to look at how Britain's laws and to do with the ECHR are interpreted by British courts, which sounds like they're going to do some kind of fudge. What's your what's your view on the ECHR?
Well, I think that it's paramount that the UK remains in the ECHR, but just in terms of the politics here, once again, it's reminiscent of the Brexit issues of David Cameron and his inability to articulate why the UK should stay in the EU. Instead, he said that the EU had to be reformed and he had to have negotiation with Brussels. And now we have Keir Starmer saying, no, we'll stay in the ECHR, but in some measure it must be reformed, whether that's the treaty itself or indeed sort of British law sort of applying or incorporating the ECHR into Westminster practice. It's already done, but wanted to tinker with in the hopes of seeing off the far right. It didn't work for David Cameron. I don't think it's going to work for Keir Starmer. I would hope that human rights barrister would be able to articulate why human rights are important, but that's a matter for him. But will it work politically? I don't think so. Of course, there is the added dimension for those who are seeking independence for Scotland, and that being part of the ECHR is a requirement for EU membership. So both for people who want Scotland to be independent and into the EU, and indeed people who want the UK to rejoin the EU, leaving the ECHR would be another barrier to rejoining the EU that would need to be overcome. So beyond the fact that the UK would be joining Russia and Belarus, being the European countries, memory serves, who are not fully party to the ECHR, which is an interesting group to want to join, there would be that added challenge on the dimension.
Thank you, Anthony. We really are out of time on this, but Chris, just quickly. So Scotland was dragged out of the EU when Brexit happened, and now it looks like we're going to get dragged out of the ECHR. There's a pretty good chance it's going to happen, isn't there?
It's a very good chance, depending on the outcome of future Westminster elections, yes, and I think that should focus people's minds on whether Scotland should participate in future Westminster elections, and by that I mean independence. And I think that you have to we need to continue to argue the case as the benefits of ECHR, why it's important, and particularly with our immigrant community. I mean, what I really find frustrating about the whole immigration debate is that we're currently in a city which has benefited from immigration. A lot of places in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK have benefited as a direct result of immigration. Those who are seeking sanctuary, who come to our country, are not responsible for energy bills going up, which I'm sure we'll come to, or mortgage rates, or the fact that the economy is sluggish and underperforming. That is not the fault of anyone, and I'm going to deliberately use the term, seeks sanctuary into the UK. That's not their fault, and I think that we need to take on the reform rhetoric for this reason, Brian. If you were to put 2 cans of Iron Brew in this desk, most people will pick the full fat Iron Brew and not the diet Iron Brew. But what we're finding in politics is that the danger that the Labour and Conservative Party are coming onto is to be the diet version of reform. And I think that is only going to lead to more support for reform because people like the full-throated rather than some diet version. What needs to happen is that we need to take on the rhetoric and the assumptions that unfortunately reform, aided and abetted by a so-called mainstream media, are taken on, and we need to take on those arguments, because when you do, you'll find just how weak they are.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I'm definitely going to be in trouble now because we are way over time. The Housing Scotland Bill was passed with cross-party support at Holyrood this week. That's the same week that the number of social houses built in Scotland since 2007 passed the 100,000 mark. But Chris, feel I should maybe come to you first. I mean, that's a major achievement, and the latest statistics on affordable housing show that since 2007, the Scottish Government has helped deliver 140,346 affordable homes, with 1,064 of those for social rent. Maeve McGoldrick, Head of Policy and Communications for Crisis Scotland, said the passing of this bill marks a landmark moment in Scotland's journey towards ending homelessness. I mean, that would be great if she was right, but do you think she is?
Well, I do think that there are particular challenges with, and I do think there is a housing emergency in the country, because we shouldn't have anyone homeless. I think there's a number of things in the bill first that I think should be acknowledged. I do support rent controls, and I think that rent controls should happen. I think that there are clearly organisations and landlords who are at it in relation to that. And I do think if we're in a cost of living crisis, which we are, is that we need to be cognizant of the fact that we need rent controls. In terms of building housing, I think that this will probably be and should be a major issue in the forthcoming Holyrood campaign. I do think that we need to look at innovative and imaginative ways in which we can help build housing supply, particularly around housing needs and social housing. Interestingly, one of the reasons that we have the situation we have in Glasgow and in Scotland is because those who are seeking sanctuary in the UK believe and are being told, and I think with some justification, that they're more welcome in Scotland than they are in other parts of the UK, and therefore you have a situation in which when people receive their status, they are choosing to come to Scotland to live because they want to come to Scotland to live. And I do think that we need to continue to assess the need for building housing and how we can use imaginative and innovative ways of doing that. And I know that there are people in the party who are seriously looking at all those issues. And I think that we need to have a debate on that because, unfortunately, we shouldn't have anyone homeless. But I'm sad to say there are people who are homeless, who are still homeless, and we should be doing everything we can to support them.
Thank you, Chris. Anthony, I suspect this might be something, again, that you maybe haven't followed that closely. So to give you a wee bit more to bite on, this new housing bill that was passed by 89 votes to 28, as a result of that, councils will be able to implement rent control zones, which a lot of councils have been calling for. There's also this thing called AWAB's law, which will force landlords to promptly address issues hazardous to tenants' health, starting with damp and mould, and that's named after a wee Awab Ishak who died in 2020 after he was exposed to mould in his home in Rochdale. And the bill's also going to place a duty on all public sector workers to report if they believe someone is at risk of being made homeless. What are your thoughts? Is this going to be enough to eradicate homelessness in Scotland, do you think?
I don't know. Is the truthful answer? I'd like to think so. I suppose if I focus particularly on the rent control aspect, which I'm sure would be sort of something that would be welcomed by those who rent, is that if we look at what other European countries have done, this is not an area that I'm expert on. I do know that various European cities and governments have also been grappling with housing generally and with rents in particular. Have tried different approaches, including rent controls, and in some cases that they have worked, in some cases that they haven't. And I hope that as we continue to have this important discussion, and I'm presuming that the Housing Bill and eventually Housing Act is one step on the journey, to the government or indeed wider politics has finished with the discussion and debate on housing, we will continue to look to see what other European countries have done and what we can learn from that to ensure.
Thanks, Anthony. Chris, on the back of the housing bill being passed, the Housing Secretary, Mary McCallan, took the opportunity to remind us that she's got a housing emergency action plan. As part of that plan, there's going to be £4.9 billion of investment to deliver major affordable housing programme that's going to support 36,000 affordable homes over the next 4 years. She says it's going to provide homes for 24,000 children, and this is in addition to the £808 million that the Scottish Government is going to spend this year, or this financial year, to deliver another 8,000 affordable homes. I mean, the SNP really do seem to be throwing everything at this homelessness.
Yes, and I hope they continue to do, because certainly when I was an elected representative, I mean, I was finding that it's also about the type of homes as well, because a number of families need 2 and 3 bedroom, 3 and 4 bedroom houses in the social rented sector are very, very small. So we need to look at all of that, and we need to address all of that to make sure that families are looked after, and to make sure that no child goes without a home. And that, I do note that I think that John Swinney and the whole Scottish Government are looking at, and rightly so, really addressing the causes of child poverty and making sure we eliminate it. And they certainly have my full support in doing so.
Thank you, Chris. As the energy price cap goes up again, the cost of living crisis is still biting, and the poorest are facing increased energy bills. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer's Labour government still hasn't scrapped the 2-child cap. There are reports that the cap may be tapered when Rachel Reeves announces her delayed budget, but the SNP have called for it to be scrapped entirely. Chris, what do you think Rachel Reeves will do when her budget does finally land? Is Scottish Government still going to have to mitigate the 2-child cap?
Well, here's my predictions. The Westminster Government could increase the Scottish budget by £1 sterling, and they would put out a press release the following day saying that that was a record settlement. So no matter what is given, they'll claim that it's a record settlement. That's the first thing they'll do. The second thing they'll do in terms of the budget, I don't know, is because there is a will they, won't they, in relation to the 2-child cap. It does look as if those who've been pushing for some sort of reform of the 2-child cap will happen. That's my best guess. But it certainly wouldn't surprise me if they didn't, and that they try and park it and push it back for another year. I think that the key thing here is the Office of Budget Responsibility is boxing the government in terms of their downgraded forecasts about what the economy is going to look at. But I think that the biggest failure of the Labour government so far is not tackle energy prices and food prices, despite the promises to do so at the general election, in which we were told that energy bills would go down by £300. It looks like they've went up by £300 since they've been in. It wouldn't be far off that figure. I cannot understand their reluctance to deal with the energy prices, and the fact that we have a regulator who are allowing these companies, who are all these private energy companies who are making and posting record profits year after year after year. They should be subjected to a windfall tax. That's what the Blair and Brown governments did. They said, in order to fund our employment programmes, we are going to put a windfall tax in these companies, and that's exactly what should happen. But I suspect that they won't do that. They need to tackle energy, and they need to tackle food prices, because that is what people are dealing with on a daily basis. They are scared to open the envelope with their energy bill. They go to the supermarket and they can't understand what they're saying. And that's why, Brian, it's important that the work that I'm involved in with Good Food Scotland in relation to making sure that people have access to affordable foods, that we're building an affordable food space community everywhere. So in places like the Three Hills Community Supermarket in Nitshill, or the Larders in Cardonald and Linthouse, Kennishead, we now have the mobile larder starting in Ardennes and other places. This is why it's important that we need to tackle these things, because the charity sector is now picking up in government failures in regard to the cost of living. And I do think it's one of the reasons why Labour are tanking the polls, is because they're not dealing with the bread and butter issues in relation to energy and food.
Okay, thank you. Anthony, independent analysis says that energy bills are going to go up by £287 under Labour's watch, and we're talking about energy, as Chris said, Labour said that they would bring energy prices down. Instead, they're going in the opposite direction. Just to make it more relevant to your expertise, we recently had figures came out that said that Brexit has cost Scottish people individually £2,500 each since 2016. So if we had remained in the EU, then we would be better off by £2,500. Do you recognise those figures? Do you agree with them?
Well, I mean, I suppose so, Brian. I mean, it's clear that Brexit has had so many impacts on us, both directly and indirectly. They can be hard to quantify sometimes. We absolutely know that they're there. I suppose it was also a bit of a challenge for us at the start of when Scotland and the rest of the UK actually left the EU because during the pandemic. And I think in some measures it was hard to disaggregate what was the direct consequence of Brexit versus what was the consequence of pandemic or lockdowns and so on. But yes, we're in a context where we are probably worse off than we would have been generally, and things aren't better. So I mean, it's sort of lost growth, if you like, and the negatives. It's obvious if we put sort of trading barriers and other barriers between us and our closest partners, that will have negative impacts on us. And I think that many of the people who champion Brexit so profoundly sort of went quiet when they realized that the so-called benefits don't really exist. And of course, now we're in a strange context where the UK, having left the EU, we're now seeing the Labour government suggesting that we should rejoin bits of things that we had left, which I presume that most of us here might support, but recognize the irony of trying to regain crumbs of what we voluntarily gave up. I suppose in the budget context of what Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer may or may not do, it's just worth remembering, perhaps from a broader perspective, that that this is largely a product of their own choices. Rachel Reeves chose the fiscal rules that she has. She may argue that she thinks they're the right ones, but in terms of having so little fiscal headroom, and anytime there's a downgrade in the forecast for economic growth from the OBR or so on, she's scrambling to try and to make up that headroom at each budget or major statement. It doesn't seem like a good policy. When Labour first entered power after its 15-year or so gap, that would have been presumably the prime opportunity to reset the political agenda, to take big decisions and set out big policies. But it seemed from the very beginning that they were afraid of perhaps public opinion, afraid of their parliamentary party, in a defensive mode from nearly day one, which, where we look at now, it makes sense, but it seems strange that they were always starting out that way. So I suppose it's hard to tell where the budget will sort of be oriented to, given the divisions within the government and within the parliamentary Labour Party. But I suppose the broader takeaway is that, as troubled as things are, and maybe that's not surprising, but they didn't start out very well.
Thank you, Anthony. Chris, there's two things. That this projected price rise that's going to come in April is going to be due to Labour Party's nuclear tax, which is going to see Scottish bill payers paying higher rates to subsidise the creation of nuclear power stations in England. Scottish Government said there won't be any nuclear power stations built in Scotland. Then at the same time, the second thing is the Scottish Government's just announced that it's going to spend £8.5 million investment to create high quality jobs in the northeast of Scotland as part of a country's shift to clean renewable energy. How do you square those two things?
Well, if people who articulate the benefits of nuclear power need to give us an answer on what happens with the waste, it's really, really simple. What happens with the waste? And they can't answer that question effectively at all. And I think that's why there needs to be a more focused approach on renewable energy and the view that the Scottish Government's taken.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Well, that's it for this week's Full Scottish, but before we go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of you, our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. We can only exist with your support. You know that our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford just £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please just donate whatever you can afford. But thank you again to our guests, to Chris Stephens here in the studio, and to you, Anthony Salamone, from your home. Thank you for giving up your time this weekend. We really appreciate it. And thank you also to you at home for watching. So goodbye.